I'm David Temple. I'm the president of the Historical Society, and I want to welcome everybody to the first program of the 2011-2012 year. This is the first of 5. 2011 is the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War, and tonight and next month, we're going to have, Richard's going to be talking about Medfield people who served in the Civil War. Today he's going to be talking about the 12 Medfield men who died in the Civil War. In December, Sunday, December 11th, in the afternoon at the library, we're going to be having a members-only Christmas social. I'm saying this because if you're not a member, you're going to miss a great Christmas social. Okay, I want to thank Charlotte for playing Cole Porter. I love Cole Porter. Also, there's a sign-in sheet that is running around, and I asked people to sign in and put your email address on it. I sent out emails to maybe 100 or more people for this, and about a quarter of them got kicked back to me as undeliverable. So a lot of the emails that we have are out of date. So I want to keep it up to date, keep using it to build attendance at these things and build membership. We need the membership. Membership, frankly, is one of our a very important source of revenue for the Historical Society. And if we don't know who you are,
there were membership cards on the table.
Thank you. That's our membership chair. Next month is our annual meeting and election. There are a couple of openings for curators. Despite my protests, C.B. Dowd is stepping down, and we should all thank her for great service over the years. She's been a huge help. Is C.B. here? Yeah, I'm talking behind her back, and she doesn't even. But I wish she was staying, but she's not. But we have two openings, and if anyone is interested in finding out what it's like to be a curator, why don't you see me? You can see Richard Destorger. Is Bob Lutman here? Well, Phil Burr is here. Phil is on the nominating committee. So see one of us if you're interested. So last time I made a plea like this, I had the great good fortune right here of finding Claire Shaw, and she's been a terrific addition to the board. Finally, if you haven't looked already, is there anyone who hasn't walked past the Historical Society building, the museum on Pleasant Street lately? We took out the 2 monstrous overgrown yews and the overgrown juniper that had been there since about 1912, and we've replanted some. We've got Fothergillas, a pair of hollies, and some horizontal junipers by the street. And the intent is that these junipers will fill in, and we won't need any mulch. What we're trying to do is to get something that will look attractive for decades. And require very little maintenance. And I want to thank Betty Sanders. I don't know if she's here today or not, but she's a master gardener. She's active in the Mass Horticultural Society, and she's the former president of the Medfield Garden Club. She gave us some good advice as we were tackling that project. Finally, I want to introduce Richard. We've got a long program, but we've got one more musical interlude here to transition from my announcements to Richard's presentation. It's Charlotte Reineman and her grandson Matt, who's going to sing "Just Before the Battle, Mother," which is a Civil War song.
I am the song. Farewell, mother, you may never press me to your heart again. But oh, you'll not forget me, mother, if I'm numbered with the slain.
Welcome, everybody. Again, my name is Richard DeSauger, and the theme we have tonight is They Made the Ultimate Sacrifice. It's a look at 19 young men and older men from Medfield that went into the Civil War and never returned. Before we do, there are actually some seats here up front. There's like 2 here, there's 1 there, there's a couple over here. So if you don't want to stand, we do have some seats. If we have the lights. Actually, if you push the button right in on those top ones. The town of Medfield furnished 84 men during the Civil War. Of these, 18 were substitutes, obtained by the town to fill the quota. The rest were volunteer Medfield men. The population of Medfield in 1861 was 1,100. Today, it is just shy of 13,000. To give you an idea of the impact on the town, the proportional number based on the population today would be 500 Medfield men drafted or going into war. Consider for a moment what that would mean to take away from this town 500 of its most vigorous and promising young men. Of those with the Medfield ties who fought in the Civil War, 19 were killed in battle or died of wounds or diseases. And of the 19, 7 are listed on the Civil War monument on the little round top section of our Vine Lake Cemetery as lying in unknown graves. You will learn tonight that 2 of those 7 have been located. Of the unknown, some were buried hastily on the battlefield, or possibly in the turmoil and confusion of war, left unburied where they fell, and the bodies of all of them irrecoverably lost. News reached Medfield late in the day of April the 12th, 1861, of the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. In response to the attack, President Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers. President Lincoln was determined, at all costs, to save the Union. Individual states, he argued, had no right to leave the Union once they entered as a state. Events began to happen very fast everywhere. On May the 11th, the Medfield Town Meeting voted $1,000 to properly outfit and equip all volunteers from Medfield. On July the 26th, a mass meeting was held in front of this church. The Medfield Band played patriotic music, and a series of speakers urged young men of the town to join the cause to save the Union and to meet Medfield's quota of men. The poster for that mass meeting reads as follows: "Now or never. Citizens of Medfield, awake. The hour has come when you must decide whether you will come up at once, like true sons of your fathers, to meet the large cry of expiring freedom and bravely do your part in striking down the rebellion, which for the sole purpose of perpetuating slavery seeks to destroy this blessed Union and all our free institutions, or whether we shall leave this glorious work undone and take the consequences. No time is to be lost. And in order to arouse our citizens to a sense of the danger that impedes, and to provide more efficient for the raising of Medfield's quota for the rescuing army, a meeting will be held on Saturday, July the 26th, 1861, at 6 o'clock on the Common, in front of the Unitarian Church. Good speakers will be provided. Our excellent band will stir up with the notes consecrated to liberty, and the ladies, it is hoped, will cheer the meeting by their presence. Come one, come all, by order of the recruiting committee. God save the United States and confound the rebel Confederacy. And let all the people say, amen. First is Allen Alonzo Kingsbury. Upon hearing President Lincoln's request, 20-year-old Allen Alonzo Kingsbury did not wait to be called. He left his family farm on South Street, said goodbye to his mother Mary, his dad James, his 7-year-old sister, 2 teenage brothers, and he walked to Chelsea to enlist. Allen listed his occupation as a farmer. He enlisted as a private. in the 1st Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, Company H, a Chelsea company, on May the 22nd, 1861. From Boston, they worked their way to Washington, D.C. In his journal, which was dated July the 19th, 1861, he writes the following. Yesterday, we had an awful fight in a swamp called Bull Run. Company H and G were shockingly cut to pieces. About half of the 2 companies were killed or wounded. A spent cannonball struck me in the leg and fell me to the ground. I was also wounded internally by having a wounded man fall on me. I am in the hospital at Centerville. There are 20 here. Some are fatally wounded. Some are shot through the arms, the legs, the feet. One man had his ear shot off by a cannonball. One was shot through the abdomen. He cannot live. One had his leg taken off by a rifled cannonball. One was struck by a cannonball in the thigh. He cannot live. 6 of our company are dead, 6 wounded, 11 missing. Kingsbury was hospitalized for a brief time before being released and sent back home to Medfield. Kingsbury could have stayed here at Medfield. He had served his country, was wounded in battle. No one would have expected anything more. But with that strong sense of duty to country, Kingsbury re-enlisted. He returned to action on September the 11th, 1861. After 7 months of drilling and marching and fighting, Kingsbury was killed on April 26, 1862, in a charge on the Confederate works near Yorktown, Virginia. The following letter leads up to the Battle of Yorktown.
Dear father and mother, here I am again upon the sacred soil of Virginia. We left Camp Hooker last Saturday morning, went on board the steamer Kennebec. But as it stormed, we did not sail till Monday. We went as far as the south of the Potomac River, and it blew and stormed so hard that the captain of the boat dared not go out in the bay. We lay at anchor till Wednesday night when it cleared off and we set sail, but it was tremendous rough on the bay. We reached Fortress Monroe, Thursday at 9 a.m. There was a large fleet of vessels here. We went alongside the Monitor. I can assure you that she is a curious-looking thing. We saw the places where the shots from the Merrimack struck it and made dents in it. We saw the Stevens Battery and the steamer Vanderbilt, which is made to run 22 knots per hour, double engines, and steel prow. At 1 p.m. Thursday, we left the fortress for York River, Virginia. We are now at this side of the Buck River in a small creek called Buck River. The ground is very low here, but we were encamped in some pine woods. All day yesterday, steamers were coming in with troops. There are 120,000 with us right now. It was one of the greatest sights I ever saw, to see the campfires last night. As far I could see, the land seemed covered with men and horses. Close to us was a brigade of cavalry, 3,000 men. They have mounted a band with them. We are only 5 miles from Yorktown, where there's a large force of rebels. General McClellan is in command here now, in person. I've not yet seen him, for he is out with the outpost. He sent a flag of truce the other day to General Magruder, the commander at Yorktown, for him to surrender. General Magruder returned answer that he would make every house in Yorktown a hospital before he would surrender. We had rather hard fare. Some of the regulars on the outpost did not have anything to eat for 2 or 3 days, but we could get something every day as yet. The nights are cold and the days are warm and pleasant. The peach trees are in full bloom, and there are lots of them. I've yet just got up, and my fingers are so cold I can hardly hold a pencil. I will close now and go get my breakfast and coffee and hard bread. Will write as often as I get a chance to send a letter. Love to all. Goodbye, Alan.
The following letters were written to his parents following his death.
Dear Mother and Father, I received your letter of the 2nd. Glad to hear you once more, and that you are well. I am in good health, except for a slight cold. Nothing of any importance, only a few skirmishes with the rebels, of which you probably read ere this. We occupy the same ground that Washington's army did in 1781. McClellan's headquarters are in the same spot. Near one of the earthworks is the ruins of the hospital which Lafayette built. There are mounds of earth and stones showing where he had dug trenches and thrown up earthworks. There are no signs of a battle yet. We are building for our mortars and heavy siege guns and digging rifle pits for infantry to support the batteries. When all is ready, Johnny Rebel will wake up some fine morning and find the shot and shell falling into his forts at the rate from 50 to 100 per minute. Shells weighing from 10 to 200 pounds. Our pickets are so near the rebel lines that they can hear them calling the roll. We've taken 12 or 15 prisoners, with some who've come and given themselves up. They all say that the rebels are strongly fortified, but they're very dissatisfied that they're constantly fighting with themselves. A few nights ago, they were fighting all night near where our pickets were. They were having a rebellion amongst themselves. I do not blame them, although they do fare a great better deal than we do. The woods here are all blossomed out. There's any quantity of high laurel here. The boys get it in pipes, make pipes and rings of it. When we first came here, the woods were full of whippoorwills. They made me think of home, but they have been all scared away now. Mayor Fay has been here. When he came, the boys were all out of tobacco, and with no money to buy it, we have not been paid off yet. So the mayor went and bought us $12 or $15 worth and divided it amongst us. And yesterday our orderly sergeant got a lot more, so that each man had half a pound. We've got a new brigadier general. His name is Grover. Neagles was arrested 3 or 4 times. I don't know for what. Love to all, Alan.
And the last letter that he wrote.
My dear sir, you have doubtless heard that your brave and noble son, Alan A. Kingsbury, of Company 2, was wounded this morning in an attack made about daylight upon one of the advanced earthworks of the rebels before Yorktown. The wound is of a very serious nature for which he may not recover. He received a rifle ball to the abdomen, as with his company he was marching double quick upon the enemy's works. We all hope and pray that he may live, but the surgeons fear that he may not, and Alonzo himself entertains the same idea. In the meantime, however, he's perfectly calm, composed, resigned, and free from acute pain. I've just called upon him at the hospital, and his only source of disquiet seems to be you, his mother, his sister, brothers, and friends will suffer on his account. If he is called away, it will be your rich consolation that he received his death wound in the faithful and courageous discharge of his duty, and dies a martyr to the holy cause of liberty and law, and in defense of our common country's flag. I am most happy to state that the gallant charge of Company H upon the rebel entrenchment was entirely successful, and that before our men reached the ditch surrounding it, the rebels broke and fled to the woods in the wildest confusion. Our loss was killed, 3 wounded, 13 missing, none. Our loss was killed, 3, wounded, 13, missing, none. As your son, Alan, shall grow better or worse, I will write again, sometime, believe me, in admiration of him, in deepest sympathy for your affliction. Sincerely yours, W.H. Cudworth.
Allen and 3 others killed at funeral services in Chelsea on May the 7th, 1862. On May 9th, the remains of Allen Kingsbury were brought to Medfield. Services were held right here in the First Parish Church. Business of the town closed as everyone went to the service. Over half the people attending the funeral could not fit inside this church. The windows had to be open so crowds that encased the outside of the church might hear some of the proceedings. Reverend Lothrop of the Baptist Church and Reverend Bush of this, the Unitarian First Parish, offered the prayers. Kingsbury was buried in Vine Lake Cemetery in this grave that is marked by a very impressive memorial that his family had erected. Next, Caleb Howard. Caleb Howard was mustered into service early in the war on May the 22nd, 1861. With several other Medfield men, he joined the 4th Massachusetts Regiment and took part in some of the first battles of the war. The 23rd fought in several battles around the North Carolina coast. He was in the Battle of Roanoke Island, which was one of the first decided Union victories. The Battle of Roanoke Island was an amphibious operation, fought February 7 to 8, 1862, in the North Carolina Sounds, a short distance south of the Virginia border. The attacking force consisted of a flotilla of gunboats of the Union Navy, a separate group of gunboats under Union Army control, and an Army division led by Brigadier General Burnside. The defenders were a group of gunboats from the Confederate States Navy called the Mosquito Fleet under Captain Lynch, and about 2,000 Confederate soldiers commanded locally by Brigadier General Henry A. Wise. The Confederates had built 4 forts facing the water approach to the island and 2 outlying barriers. During the first day of the battle, the Federal gunboats in the forts on shore engaged in gun battle with occasional contributions from the Mosquito Fleet. Later in the day, Burnside soldiers, including Caleb Howard, went ashore unopposed. They were accompanied by 6 howitzers, manned by sailors. As it was too late to fight, the invaders went to camp for the night. On the second day, February the 8th, Caleb and the Union soldiers advanced, but was stopped by an artillery battery that accompanied infantry in the center of the island. Although the Confederates thought that their line was safely anchored by the surrounding swamps, they were flanked on both sides when Caleb and the Union soldiers walked waist-deep through the swampy waters. The Confederates were then driven back to the refuge of the forts. The forts were now surrounded. With no way for his men to escape, Confederate Colonel Shaw surrendered to avoid pointless bloodshed. The Union forces occupied the island for the remainder of the war. Caleb Howard took an active part in the battles of Kingston, Whitehall, and Goldsboro. These hardships of the campaigns, along with the southern heat and the humidity, so reduced his health and strength that in November of 1863, he was discharged for disability, and he returned to Medfield, but not to stay. Regaining his health, he re-enlisted again, this time as a private in the 58th Massachusetts. At the time of his re-enlistment, he was 32 years old. His occupation listed was that of a bonnet presser. He was with General Grant in his advance upon Richmond. For months, the fighting was almost continuous, the Union forces pushing gradually forward, and the Confederates contesting every foot of the Union advance. The Union and Confederate lines were often within yards of each other, and frequent charges and countercharges were made. Day and night, the soldiers lay in the trenches, rushing forward a few yards in charges, and then burrowing in the ground to protect themselves from the rebel bullets. Exposed to the scorching southern sun by day and the chills of night, without shelter of any kind, and often with insufficient food and clothing, Caleb Howard and the other soldiers fought on, week after week, with little gain or loss on either side. On September the 30th, 1864, the 36th Regiment was hotly engaged with the enemy, and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Caleb Howard fell, mortally wounded. He died a few hours later. Next, William Holbrook. William Holbrook was 24 years old, and he was a farmer by occupation when he mustered into the service on August the 7th, 1862. He was assigned to the Pioneers. Now, the duty of the Pioneers was to go ahead of the main army and prepare the road for the soldiers and the artillery. Holbrook worked ahead of General Sherman's army, you can see there, as he made his way through Georgia from Atlanta to the sea. After they had reached Savannah on the coast, Sherman turned northward through North Carolina. He was opposed by Confederate General Joe Johnson. On March 15, 1865, a considerable force of the enemy was encountered at Averasboro, North Carolina. During the attack, Holbrook was transferred from the pioneer service to the ranks of the Massachusetts 33rd and was with his company on the skirmish line. Now, having no experience of this kind of fighting, he was placed at a considerable disadvantage. He was behind a tree near a brook, loading and firing, when late in the afternoon, he was shot through the head by a rebel sharpshooter. David Maney, his friend and comrade from Medfield, saw him fall and rushed to his assistant. And that would be the relative of our current police chief, Bob Meany. With another comrade, they carried him to the rear of the line, but he never recovered, and he died in that Averasboro field. William Vino. William Vino was a young German immigrant who was working in Medfield as a cabinet maker when he too enlisted in the 33rd Massachusetts on August the 2nd, 1862. Just before the Battle of Getttysburg, on the march from Virginia to Pennsylvania, he was captured and sent here to this Libby prison in Richmond, Virginia. There he died of disease on December the 8th, 1863, and was buried in that prison cemetery. More than 50,000 men passed through this prison while it was used by the Confederacy. The prisoners were not kept on the ground floors. The west ground floor was used as offices and guard rooms, and the middle part was used as a kitchen. The cellars contained cells for the dangerous prisoners, spies, slaves, under sentence of death, and there was also a carpenter shop down there. For most of the time, the commandant was Major Dick Turner. Its capacity was reported at 1,200, although it's certain at times this was exceeded. A group of surgeons, upon their release from Libby Prison, published an account of what they experienced treating the inmates in the hospital. And they write as follows: "Thus, we have over 10% of the whole number of prisoners held classed as sick men who need the most skillful attention, yet in the essential manner of rations, they are receiving nothing but cornbread and sweet potatoes. Meat is no longer furnished to any class of our prisoners except a few officers in Libby Hospital. And all the sick or well office or private are now furnished with a very poor article of cornbread in place of the wheat bread, unsuitable diet for hospital patients prostrated with diarrhea, dysentery, fever, to say nothing of the balance of the startling instances of individual suffering and horrid pictures of death from protracted sickness, semi-starvation that we have thrust upon our observations. The first demand of the poor creatures from the island was always to get something to eat. Self-respect, gone. Hope and ambition, gone. Half-clad and covered with vermin and filth. Many of them are too often beyond all reach of medical skills. In one instance, the ambulance brought 16 to the hospital, and during the night, 7 of them died. Again, 18 were brought. 11 of them died in the first 24 hours. At another time, 14 were admitted, and in a single day, 10 of them died. Judging from what we ourselves have seen and do know, we do not hesitate to say that under a treatment of systematic abuse, neglect, and semi-starvation, the number who are becoming permanently broken down in their constitutions must be reckoned by the thousands. The windows, which had no glass, just heavy iron bars, constituted the deadline in Libby Prison. Anyone leaning out the window, even peering or putting their hands on the sills or bars, was instantly shot. On April the 3rd, 1864, one soldier by the name of John Forsyth, and he was with the 100 Ohio Volunteers, was shot dead while standing in front of one of these windows. The shot passed right through Forsyth, killing him, and then hit Douglas O'Kelly in the throat. Here are the conditions William Vino died on December the 8th, 1863. Next, Frank E. Morse. Now, Frank E. Morse was born and brought up here in Medfield. He was first wounded in the terrible charge upon Fort Wagner in July of 1862. Any of you that have seen the movie Glory will recognize Fort Wagner. Morse recovered from his wounds on the attack on Fort Wagner, and later was with the Union forces on the siege of Petersburg, just outside the capital of Richmond. The fighting here had almost been continuously going on day and night until the troops were exhausted. Burrowing in the ground at night to make beds for themselves to catch a few minutes of sleep, free from the dangers of rebel bullets, facing near starvation due to insufficient food, they fought on day after day. On August the 15th, 1864, Morse and the Union troops, with fixed bayonets, cocked rifles, were ordered to rush forward into the thick woods. Suddenly, they came into an open area, beyond which about 100 yards away was a strong rebel earthwork. Instantly, the Confederates opened up fire with their howitzers. The Union troops continued their charge, leaping and climbing over fallen logs and up and over the earthworks into the rebel rifle pits, engaging the enemy in hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and club muskets, causing the rebels to retreat. During this charge, Frankie Morse fell and was killed. He lies today in an unmarked grave in that Virginia battlefield. Joseph Hardy. Now, Joseph Hardy was actually the oldest of the Medfield volunteers. He enlisted at the age of 42. He left behind his wife, one son, 3 stepsons. He enlisted October 31, 1861 in Company D of the 30th Massachusetts, fighting with his regiments around the swamps in Vicksburg and in the Battle of Baton Rouge. He contracted malaria, then known as swamp fever, and he died. More than 300 of the 30th Massachusetts died of malaria. Now, malaria was a common but generally misunderstood disease during the time of the American Civil War. It was believed in the time that malaria was a sickness caused by breathing poisonous swamp gases. And although breakouts of malaria would occur during times of widespread mosquito attacks, the two occurrences were never considered to be related. As deadly as malaria is today, it was a killer even more during the Civil War, when the art of medicine was really barbaric and generally an unreliable practice. It's estimated that malaria is responsible for killing 25% of all servicemen during the Civil War. John Strang. He enlisted from Massachusetts in the 4th Massachusetts Company F on July the 22nd, 1861 as a private. He was 21 years old at the time. He had re-enlisted in Company A, 1st Massachusetts Volunteer Cavalry, on September 16, 1861. He listed his occupation as a cabinet maker. We believe he was the brother of Cyrus and Gabriel Strang, you'll hear about Gabriel shortly, who also served in the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry. John and Cyrus were in the Battle of Aldie, Virginia, June of 1863. Both were wounded, with John dying of the wounds on July 28, 1863. Now, after a tremendous victory at Chancellorsville, General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia left Fredericksburg through the gaps in the Blue Ridge Mountain to block key mountain passes and screen the Army's movement from the Union cavalry. He planned on going through the Shenandoah Valley north towards Pennsylvania. A major problem for Major General Joseph Hooker was to ascertain Lee's whereabouts and direction. On June 17th, this task was entrusted to Union cavalry under Brigadier General Alfred Pleston, who ordered a movement from Manassas Junction to Aldie, a village located in the junction of roads between the Blue Ridge Mountains to Winchester, an excellent base for reconnaissance into the valley. Major General Jeb Stewart, 2nd and 3rd Virginia Cavalry, screened the Confederate infantry under Colonel Thomas Mumford as it marched north behind the sheltering Blue Ridge Mountains. Soon the Confederate cavalrymen met their adversaries, who were probing west to try to locate Lee and determine his intentions. Mumford made a stand at Aldie, and Union cavalry under Brigadier General Kilpatrick engaged the Confederate forces. The result was 4 hours of stubborn fighting. Both sides made mounted assaults by regiments and squadrons. After being reinforced in the afternoon, Kilpatrick finally drove the Confederate force from town to the west. In the afternoon of sharp fighting, Munford was pressed back, but the Federals were severely bloodied in their scattered actions. It was here that John Strang was killed. This monument marks that. His name is actually on that. Next, we're going to talk about the Chenery family. They suffered perhaps more than anyone else, with 3 members of their family killed during the Civil War. Frank A. Chenery was killed in the Battle of Cold Harbor. Now, the Battle of Cold Harbor, just outside Richmond, under General Grant, you see there on the slide, was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. In the first 10 minutes of fighting, 7,000 Union troops were killed or wounded. In the first 10 minutes. Frank Chenery was one of them. He was 25 years old. Brother James was killed on July the 2nd, 1865, at the Battle of Getttysburg. And his cousin, John Chenery, was killed the following day at Getttysburg. Now, James was killed in the fight you see here at the Stonewall. He was shot through the neck, and he died immediately. He was buried right where he fell. He was just 19 years old. John was killed the following day at Gettysburg by the Confederate bombardment, making way for the infamous Pickett's charge. John was just 17 years old. All 3 lie next to one another today in Vine Lake Cemetery. Gettysburg clearly was the bloodiest battle of the war, lasting some 3 days. It's just unbelievable the amount of death on that one battlefield. Eugene Sumner was 19 years old. He enlisted in the 2nd Massachusetts as a private on May 25, 1861. He was stationed in the occupation of Louisville, Kentucky, when he became ill during the winter of 1863-1864. Taken to the hospital, he died there on January the 24th, 1864. And Curtis W. Jones, he enlisted in the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry on August the 5th, 1862 as a private. He'd been working here in Medfield as a carriage maker. He died 4 months later at Potomac Creek, Virginia, of chronic diarrhea, which was one of the main causes of death in the crowded army camps. He was just 19 years old. Now, 2 from Medfield have only brief records. We know very little about them, their service, or how they died. One was Eleazar Johnson. The only information we have on him is that he died in the hospital in Reedville, section of Boston. There is no mention in the records of what regiment he belonged to or how he died. And then there's George W. Kingsbury, the son of Horace and Elizabeth Kingsbury and a cousin of Alonzo Kingsbury. George enlisted from Dedham in the 4th Massachusetts Cavalry Company B on December the 14th, 1863 as a private. He was discharged for disability on May 22nd, 1865. He died the following August in a hospital in Dedham due to the disease he contracted at camp. He's buried here in Vine Lake Cemetery. Now, George was not part of the Medfield quota, but he was 18 years old at the time of his enlistment. Now, later in the war, to avoid the draft, the amount of killing was just so unbelievable. A man could actually pay another man to serve for him. Now, these substitutes, they were called, many times made very poor soldiers because sometimes they only wanted the money and then they would desert the first chance they got. It then became a war where the poor had to fight and the rich could get out of the war, especially after Lincoln instituted the draft. This inequity led to the draft riots in New York City, the worst draft riots in our nation's history. So bad were these draft riots in New York City that U.S. troops on their way to Gettysburg had to be ordered back to quell the riots. And we had to use our own Navy ships that actually shelled New York City to stop the rioting. Now, 18 men from Medfield hired substitutes to take their place. 2 of these substitutes were killed. John Doherty was bought as a substitute on January the 4th, 1864. He enlisted as a private in the 56th Massachusetts, Company E. He was 42 years old, and he was from the town of Whately, out by Amherst Way. His occupation was a brass molder. He died of disease in Boston on February the 10th, 1864, serving just a little over 1 month. And the other substitute we have record of in Medfield was William Daly. He enlisted into the 7th Battery Massachusetts Volunteers Light Artillery on December 17, 1864, as a private. He was a 21-year-old laborer from Lowell. He was killed in the line of duty on July 31, 1865, near Waverly, Texas. Now, the records of him go on to say that, quote, in an expedition to Waverly on July 29th to arrest a murderer, Private William Daly was mortally wounded. Richard C. Derby. Now, Richard Derby was the son of Elias and Mary Derby, and he grew up around the corner on Frary Street by Cottage Street. In addition to his parents, he had a brother and a sister. His brother Benjamin died when he was just 8 years old. His father died when he was 6. Richard spent many summers along the water with relatives in Salem, and he attended school in Groton Academy. After working a short time in Boston, he went west to Minnesota and Wisconsin, where he worked actually as a salesman in a store before spending much time with nature on the then wilderness. In the spring of 1859, he returned here to Massachusetts. When war broke out, he enlisted in the 15th Massachusetts Regiment, and he was commissioned a 2nd lieutenant. He was mustered into service on July the 12th, 1861. Now, much has been written about Derby in the history of the 15th Massachusetts, and his letters were collected in a book that we have called The Young Lieutenant that was written. And we're going to read just a little bit of that. In that, he writes an excellent description of the Battle of Ball's Bluff, which took place in Virginia. Now, Ball's Bluff on October 21st, 1861, was a battle in which the Union Brigade crossed the river with great confusion and great loss. This is how Derby writes how he escaped.
It is a mystery to me how any man escaped the shower of bullets that was poured upon us for 2 hours. The pieces of artillery seemed to be the especial target of the sharpshooters, and hardly a man was left standing by them after the second volley. I had always been afraid that the men would become unmanageable, but I was never more disappointed. Through the whole affair, from our embarkation in the miserable little skiffs to the retreat down to the bluffs, they obeyed every order as promptly as though they were merely drilling, and fought as coolly as veterans. They showed the real English pluck, and I think, if they had not seen that it was a hopeless and desperate fight, they would have added some of the French dash, and carried everything before them. Early in the forenoon, Colonel H and a skirmish on its own account with a company of Mississippi riflemen. We got the better of them, even with our old smoothbore muskets, but then had to fall back on the shelter of the woods on the approach of the cavalry. Our loss was 17 killed in that affair, and in the same great battle. I went through the whole of it without a scratch and not even a hole in my clothes. I was very much disappointed, as some officers had 3 or 4 bullets through their coats and caps, so I made up for it by nearly drowning myself in the Potomac. I hadn't a suspicion but what I could swim across with ease, so I pulled off my boots and laid my sword, pistol, and belt on a small boat to push across. I was anxious to save my sword as it looked too much like surrendering to lose it. I kept all my clothes at home, my pockets full. I pushed off quite deliberately, although the water was drowning soldiers and bullets from the rebels on top of the bluff. I made slow progress with one hand and had to abandon my raft to cargo. I got along very well, a little more than halfway, when I found that every effort I made only pushed my head underwater, and it suddenly flashed across me that I should drown. I didn't feel any pain or exhaustion. The sensation was exactly like being overcome with drowsiness. I swallowed water in spite of all I could do, till at last I sank unconscious. There was a small island near Harrison's, against which the current drifted me, and aroused me enough to crawl a step or two, but not enough to know what I was doing until I dropped just at the edge of the water with my head in the soft clay mud. My good fortune still continued, and Colonel Devens, swimming across on a log, landed right where I lay. He had me taken up and carried over to the Harrison's Island to a good fire, where I soon began to feel quite comfortable, but afterwards taken sick, and still this time recovering. I should have returned to duty today if the weather hadn't been so stormy. I feel as if in answer to the many prayers of my friends that I've saved will last through so many victories.
Richard C. Derby was killed in the Battle of Antietam near Sharpsburg, Maryland, the bloodiest single-day battle of the war. And the following letter describes Derby's death.
Captain Derby was spared the anguish he must have felt, and he lived through all the carnage of that dreadful day. For he was among those first called to lay down their lives for their country. His companion and friend, Lieutenant, now Captain Gale, thus described his last hours in a letter to his bereaved mother, dated Bolivar, Virginia, September 24th, 1862. My dear madam, I trust that you will pardon my delay in giving you the particulars of that sad event, the announcement of which has already reached you. Our poor wounded comrades have engrossed so much of our attention that we have not found time to communicate with the friends and relatives of those gone from us to return no more. Even now it is painful in the extreme to bring again the picture of the terrible day. We left camp in cheerful spirits, though with something like a premonition of the great events that were ahead. I chatted pleasantly with Richard, who was almost a brother to me, and we went forward hand in hand, as it were, as we had done before. When we approached the enemy, he asked me to attend the men on the right of the company, while he gave orders to those on the left. In a moment, heavy volleys were poured into our ranks, and finding myself slightly wounded, I sought the shelter of a tree. While binding my wound, I saw the lieutenant cheering on his men in the most heroic manner. It was a scene that I can never forget. 2 minutes later, he was also laid to rest, and laid at the foot of the tree, fatally wounded in the temple. He was quite unconscious, apparently in almost a childlike sleep, and thus, without suffering, he passed from life to immortality. Oh, how sad it is his dear friend Major Philbrick and myself gaze upon his fair face. We exchanged significant and sorrowful glances, and looking at the battle before us, we found ourselves nearly surrounded by the enemy. Hastily retreating, we were obliged to leave our dead and wounded, but before this, I'd secured every little thing of value about our dear brother except his sword and belt. This was so firmly fastened I could not secure it. On the following day, we made 3 attempts to get across those who were left behind, but the enemy refused to grant this privilege. On Friday, the field was deserted, and so much time had been elapsed since the engagement that it was almost impossible to recognize the familiar faces. Such a great change had taken place that we were obliged to relinquish our desire and send home the remains for interment, and they were buried in a small garden spot quite near the scene of action. It is known as the Lucha Place, and is about 1 mile from the village of Sharpsburg. Anyone in the neighborhood will point out the location. The exact spot is marked by a headboard, and the proprietor has promised that this, together with those that are near it, shall be preserved. Yesterday, Major Philbrick and myself, with the aid of a borrowed key, his own being lost, unlocked his valise and placed in it his watch, pistol, gold, ring, and other articles of value. Today I have directed this to you at Auburndale, and shall forward it by Adams Express. And if I can be of any further service, do not, I beg of you, fail to allow me the privilege. I have found him in such a general companion, with so much to love and respect, that I could not quite reconcile myself to the thought that we were parted for this life. And yet I almost long to be with him, if I might have a record of a fair name and a glorious record. This line is constantly in my mind, and will always associate itself with his memory. That life is long, which answers life's great end. Deeply sympathizing with you in your great bereavement, I am, with much respect, your obedient servant, Walter Gale.
Richard C. Derby's body was later reinterred from that battlefield, and he is buried today in Vine Lake Cemetery. We have two, we interrupt this regularly scheduled program to bring you the following breaking news. We have 2 additional soldiers we have new information on, and I want to introduce Judge Gray, first of all.
Good evening. I'm going to talk about Daniel McMahon, a Civil War soldier from Medfield. I first became interested in Civil War history here in Medfield when I visited the monument to the unknown dead at Vine Lake. It's at the corner of Dale and Route 27. If you've never been there, it's a very moving place. The monument was dedicated in 1907 to the 7 Medfield men who died in the war and were thought to be lost on the battlefield in the South. Since my daughter Kathy lives in Chattanooga, Tennessee, she's a high school graduate from Medfield, my wife and I have been there many times to Chattanooga. So we became interested in Daniel McMahon because he was lost in Chattanooga. We've been to the city many times, and we've visited most of the local Civil War sites in Chattanooga, and perhaps you've heard of some of them. Missionary Ridge, Signal Mountain, Nob Hill, Lookout Mountain, and just over the line into Georgia is the Chickamauga Battlefield. In my research of Daniel, I found that he joined the Army at age 18 from Medfield. He was listed as a farmer, and he left Medfield with 8 others, and he traveled to Camp Stanton in Lynnfield, Massachusetts. That's where they were mustered in to the 33rd Mass Infantry in Company H. These are the men from Medfield who were in his unit, and I think you've heard of some of them this evening. You may know some of the names, but as you run down to David Meany, which is spelled 3 different ways, if you do any Civil War research, you've got to take spelling into account because people spelled the way they heard it. And it's M-A-N-E-Y, it's M-A-N-Y, it's lots of different things. This is Chief Meany's great-great-grandfather, David, who survived the war. Just a quick synopsis on some of these people. Babcock was 36. Listen to the ages of these people. 36, he's buried here in Medfield. Chenery was 16. He died at Getttysburg. Griffin was 42 when he went in. He lived to be age 75. Michael Griffin, I don't think I know much about him. Holbrook, he was age 35 when he died in North Carolina. Maney obviously survived. McMahon died at age 18. 18, those are high school seniors today. Seguski was 23, and Vennar, spelled 2 different ways, V-E-N-N-A-H or V-E-N-N-O-H. William was 43 when he died at Liberty Prison. We've heard about that. I've read the regimental history of the 33rd. That takes you detail by detail with names and places, day by day. They went in August of 62, and it follows them right through to June of 65, where they were. And I won't bore you with all the details, but basically, in August of 62, they were mustered in Massachusetts. That's where they formed up. And then they headed to Washington, D.C. to do defense of the city. So they didn't see much action at that point, or hadn't seen any. But in 1863, life got very interesting for the 33rd Company H. They participated at Chancellorsville. They went to Getttysburg in July of 63. And then they were called to go to Chattanooga. So they took a train from the northeast Washington, and they traveled across Ohio, Indiana, and down through Kentucky to Tennessee. And this is where it got interesting for Daniel. They were trained to Bridgeport, Alabama, where they were trying to break the Confederate hold on what is known as the Cracker Line. The troops were already in Chattanooga, having fought at Chickamauga previously, and they were running out of foods. So the Cracker Line was a flow of food to the Union troops, and they were trying to break that so we could feed the troops in Chickamauga. So in October of '63, they marched into Lookout Valley, Tennessee. And let me show you what that looks like. You're standing here on the top of Lookout Mountain. This is a modern postcard I purchased. You're looking down on the Tennessee River. It flows from the right to the left. And this is called Moccasin Bend. The river starts up in Knoxville and flows. It's a beautiful river. You're 2,100 feet above the water. It's an unbelievable view. They have an incline railroad today that you can take up to the top of Lookout Mountain, and they claim it's the steepest in the world. Whether that's true or not, it's 72% at the top. It's a scary ride. So the Confederates were on top of Lookout Mountain. The Union Army was holding Chattanooga, where those buildings are off to the right. But the Union wanted to push the Confederates off the mountain. So the way they got it started, one night, they went onto the river with 1,200 men in 50 rafts, and they flowed down past Moccasin Bend, down to Brown's Ferry, and they went ashore. And they actually did it. They got the men there under cover of darkness, and then some Union figured something was going on, and a battle began. Daniel McMahon participated in the Battle of Wauhatchie. It was a night battle, and this was one of the first night battles of the Civil War. And it's very complicated, not only to move men and machines during the day, but at night it's next to impossible. But they got into Lookout Valley, and they got the call at midnight to advance. As they were advancing, a voice called out, "Don't fire on us. Who are you?" The voice was coming from the Confederates, asking who the troops were, wondering whether they're their own men. And foolishly, somebody from the 33rd said, "We're the 33rd Massachusetts." And all of a sudden, bingo, the rebels opened fire, and 35 members of the unit were killed and 58 wounded. 3 men from Medfield were in the fight, and that's David Meany, who we know about, Daniel McMahon, and Michael Griffin. In the early light of the morning, Daniel was found dead on the hill. So from 1862 until 2010, Daniel was thought to have been lost on the battlefield. However, my wife and I, in one of our visits to Chattanooga, spoke with a Civil War expert at the Chickamauga Battlefield Museum, and he suggested that we look at the National Cemetery in Chattanooga. So one day we drove there and went up to the office, and they have a person with a computer, and we said, "We're looking for Daniel McMahon, M-C-M-A-H-O-N. "No, we don't have him." "How about M-C-M-A-H-A-N? "Oh yeah, we've got him." So spelling is key. You got to know, well, you got to try it both ways to see what happens. We then drove up to the top of the hill to B541, and there was Daniel McMahon's gravesite. That's his grave right there with the yellow arrow. You're looking at Lookout Mountain in the background, and to the right, that steep slope, that was where the Battle of Wauhatchie took place. So he was carried off the battlefield and buried here with many of his comrades. It's a beautiful cemetery, and we feel privileged to have found it. This is a closer view of Daniel McMahon, M-C-M-A-H-A-N. So this closes out the story of the find of Daniel, except I'm not really through with the research. I just wrote to the federal government in Washington a couple of weeks ago, and you can pay $25 and get his record. and I was hopeful of some genealogical information, but there was nothing other than the fact he lost his knapsack in July of '63. Other than that, he was a great soldier. He showed up every month and he was on the monthly roster. But I'm trying to find out, where was he born, when, who were his parents, possible siblings, does he still have family today, when did he come to America, and why did he come to Medfield? I can't find him. He's not in the 1860 census. So there's still a mystery out there. I've solved part of it, but not all of it. There's an Eagle Scout project at the cemetery, and they recognize the lost soldiers in the South. So I'm hopeful that at some point, some sort of a little plaque can go on there and say, Daniel's been found. We've brought him back, part of him, to Medfield. Thanks very much. Do you have any questions for me? I'll now turn it over to Rob Gregg, who has another story for you.
Challenged by George's find, I selected another veteran who was listed on the monument and proceeded to do some research on Gabriel Strang. Unfortunately enough, we have a wonderful photograph of him, and you see it here. Gabriel was the youngest of 13 children born to Daniel and Susan Chapel Strang in the most northern town of Nova Scotia in Tidnish. He came south to Massachusetts, and at the ripe old age of 33 enlisted in the 1st Cavalry Regiment of Massachusetts. At the time of his enlistment, he was living in New Salem, Massachusetts, a ways from here, but he was assigned to the Medfield contingent, and that's where he received his notoriety. He was transferred 2 years later after his enlistment into the 4th Cavalry Regiment of Massachusetts. And one of the very fortunate things about Gabriel Strang was that 5 years ago, letters of his and a photograph of his were auctioned, and so we have some information that's been transcribed from the letters. And one of the things that we found reading the letters was that when he was in the cavalry, his job was to be the bugler. And so that has great import for what happened to him and in terms of his death. One of the things that happens with a wonderful story like this, for some reason, why is a woman always involved in it? Well, that happened with the letters that Gabriel is writing to someone. The first page of the letters has disappeared, so we do not know who it's addressed to. But we pulled some things out of it relative to his connection to Medfield. Cyrus was his brother. So he was writing to this woman saying that if you ever get to Medfield, seek out my brother Cyrus, and he'll take care of you. He also takes a very personal opinion of himself as a soldier, and writes these words to whoever was reading his letter. Gabriel was killed at the Battle of High Bridge in Virginia. It was a very minor skirmish. If the killing of 847 people can be considered minor, but on some of the battles in the Civil War, we know that the number of soldiers killed was far greater. This is the actual 1865 photo of High Bridge in Virginia. Thanks to the people, the artists at Brockton City Hall, we have a wonderful painting of the charge, which was the ultimate charge for Gabriel. And that painting is on exhibit at the City Hall in Brockton. And looking closely at it, there's a bugler in it. Now, is it a stretch to say that it's Gabriel? It could be, but at least we see what happens to a bugler in the midst of battle, because he is the one that is signaling the commands that had been given to him by the officers as to how the unit is to fight, in which direction, and what they're to do. So he has a very important role. So perhaps that's Gabriel, perhaps it isn't. He was killed in Highbridge, Virginia, and he was first buried in Rice Station, and ultimately he is buried in Petersburg at Poplar Grove National Cemetery. Now, working with the National Park Service, we were able to locate the gravesite of Gabriel Strang. This is the memorial that is there for him. It is a horizontal memorial, which is quite different from the memorials here in White Lake Cemetery that we're familiar with, which are all vertical. And one of the blessings of them being like that is that in November of each year, Poplar Grove Cemetery has a luminary service. So as you can see, each of the luminaries is placed on the bottom part of the memorial. And if you were there, you would see 6,000 luminaries at this particular cemetery. So we've come full circle now. We found the burial place of Gabriel Strang, who was in 1907 first thought to have been buried at a distant gravesite. But you just need to easily imagine what the resources were to people in 1907 for them to do research compared to what it is that we can do today. And so the people did the best they could back then, and Gabriel is listed there. This is the memorial. We now have 2 out of the 7 veterans identified as being buried in distant cemeteries. We will not invoke a 1-year demolition delay on this memorial. We'll keep it the way it is. We will make some corrective addition to it in terms of the plaques on the front side, but we won't touch the memorial. Interestingly enough, there are 3 Strang brothers who are now all buried, or 2 of them are here at Wine Lake Cemetery. Cyrus and John, you've heard remarks about both of them. They're buried in grave sites with markers that were funded by the United States government. These 2 gentlemen and many others will be the subject of the walking tour, which will be on a wonderful fall, sunny, dry day. And on October 15th, you can count on that. There are 53 Civil War veterans buried at Wine Lake Cemetery in the old section. Some of these are gentlemen who served in the war, happened to be living in Medfield when they died, and so they're buried here, but they may not have service attributed to Medfield. Others we've heard before already, such as Alonzo Kingsbury, Richard Crown and Shield Derby. These veterans are buried at the cemetery. We will stop at 24 of these 53 sites, for which there will be short stories told about some aspect of their life. We're very fortunate that we're going to have a reenactment color guard and their commanding officer, a drummer, and 2 female civilians who will participate in some pageantry of that day. So it's a grand event on Saturday the 15th from 10 to 1. And for the students here, the admission is free. And so with that, I return it to Richard.
We're going to close the program tonight with the words of Richard Derby's mother. When she wrote about the Battle of Gettysburg, almost a year after her son's death, and again, it's in this book, which is a great story how we received this. It's called The Young Captain. And this is about maybe 10 years ago. We received a call from a gentleman down in Maryland, and his dad had just died, and they were cleaning the house out, and he came across this book, Richard Derby's pistol, his diary, and he did research, and he found that Derby was tied to Medfield. He called up here to the Historical Society. He said, I could probably get money on eBay, but I think this is something that really belongs to the town of Medfield. And he drove up here himself and presented it to us. So that's how we were able to get that. But I want to close by what Mrs. Derby had to say about a year after her son's death when she heard about the news of Gettysburg. And she writes the following, and I think this summarizes all 19 we've heard about tonight. Our Massachusetts boys were not mere machines, coarse and brutal stuff, food for powder, but the best blood, the brightest hope, the noblest, fairest young men, the flower and pride of our best homes. New England sent her best when the call to arms came. Our brave ones have indeed covered themselves with honor. Heavy losses come with our victories, and we could scarcely bear to rejoice did we not know that those who have fallen now and earlier in the struggle would ardently join us could they speak. We have poured out at Gettysburg another costly libation of blood drawn from the veins of the youth and manhood of our land. But they felt that their country called, and they have laid down their lives in a holy cause and ascertained on high to join the immortal Washington and his compatriots. As we bereaved mothers and sisters and friends sit weeping at home, counting among the killed our dear sons and brothers, what an unutterable pain shoots through the heart. Nature must, for the hour, have her due in sighs and tears and choking agony. But soon the thoughts come that they fell for their country and their great cause, and that their sacrifices will bring joy and peace and freedom to generations yet unborn. Therefore we must be comforted, for our dear Richard still lives and is glorified. His life was not wasted in this great struggle for his country and its institutions. He and they have paid costly price for a magnificent good. They have won the meed of eternal honor and remembrance. We shall never be obliged to write of our dear ones, craven or coward or traitor, for they have sealed their testimony with their blood, and we can forever unite and sing honor to the brave, blessing to the loyal, praise from heaven and earth on the noble soldier who was not afraid to die, so his country shall live. Before I close, I just want to thank Kabir Tharte for the dramatic reading of both Kingsbury and Richard Derby, Charlotte Reineman and her grandson for the music and singing in the very beginning, George Gray and Rob Gregg for their performance here. You've been a great audience. Hopefully we learned something tonight. Thank you.
Production support provided by Medfield.tv. Access to our community.